The door creaked open, a heavy, suffocating smell of dust and old leather filling the air. It was not the kind of museum one would casually visit. This was something darker, more sinister. The walls were lined with glass cases, each containing grotesque, disfigured objects, a broken porcelain doll with eyes that seemed to follow every movement, a rusted guillotine blade that had once taken more than just a life, and an antique camera with a cracked lens that looked as if it had captured the final moments of someone's soul. The dim light flickered above, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked tile floor. The floors themselves were stained, the remnants of something long since forgotten, perhaps blood, perhaps something worse. An old, haggard woman sat behind a counter in the corner, her gnarled fingers knitting a sweater, though her eyes never strayed from the visitors who dared step inside. The air was oppressive, thick with a quiet, unnerving hum, something between the distant buzzing of a fly and the whisper of someone calling your name from just out of sight. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes as she beckoned the group of unsuspecting tourists further into the maze of the museum. "Not many make it this far," she murmured, her voice raspy, like the scraping of dry leaves. "You've come for the stories, haven't you? The ones that never leave." The group, a mixture of thrill-seekers and curious minds, nodded, though they couldn't quite shake the feeling that they were being watched by more than just the old woman. The first room was an odd collection of macabre artifacts, a velvet-covered chair, pristine despite its age, with thick, old-fashioned straps on the arms and legs. A sign above it read, "The Chair of Eternal Suffering." The tour guide, a nervous young man with dark circles under his eyes, explained how the chair had been used in various torture chambers across Europe in the 18th century. As he spoke, the air seemed to grow colder, the light dimming with each word. "People say," he continued, "that the chair, it doesn't forget. It remembers every soul that was strapped to it, and on certain nights it cradles the new." He faltered, a shiver running down his spine. He glanced nervously at the back of the room, where a large mirror had just come into view. There was something strange about it. It didn't reflect the room in its entirety. The tourists edged closer to get a better look, and that's when they noticed it, dark smears running along the mirror's surface, like something had been pressed against it, struggling to break free. The guide stepped back quickly, his face pale. That's part of the collection," he stammered. "It's a living artifact." The woman at the counter chuckled darkly, her voice echoing down the hall. "They all are, my dear," she said cryptically. As the group continued to move through the museum, a sense of dread began to settle over them like a thick fog. Each new display was more disturbing than the last. A room filled with shrunken heads, their eyes glistening with a knowing, malevolent gleam. A tapestry woven from human hair, threads tangled in a grotesque pattern that seemed to pulse with life. An entire display dedicated to cursed objects, each one supposedly linked to unsolved disappearances and violent deaths. The air felt heavier with every step, as though the very walls were closing in. It was in the last room where the true terror of the museum revealed itself. The door to the room was locked, but the woman behind the counter had gestured for them to follow her. She had not moved a muscle, yet somehow the door clicked open, as if it had been waiting for them. The room was small, its walls lined with dusty paintings that seemed to be filled with unblinking eyes. In the center of the room stood an old wooden pedestal, and on it a small ornate box. The tour guide hesitated, then slowly moved toward it, his hands trembling. "This," he said in a whisper, "is the Box of Souls. It's said to be a prison for lost spirits, but it's more than just a myth." The room grew unnervingly silent as the group watched him lift the box. The temperature dropped dramatically, and the low hum that had been growing louder now surged into a deafening wail, like 1,000 voices crying out at once. The walls began to shake, and something inside the box began to move, shifting with a terrible, unnatural rhythm. The tour guide opened the box, and in an instant the room was flooded with a dark, oily mist that seemed to pulse with anger. The group screamed and tried to flee, but the doors slammed shut and the air became thick, suffocating. Shapes began to form in the fog, twisted, contorted forms of people long dead, their faces distorted in eternal agony. You've unleashed them now, the woman's voice echoed from nowhere. They've been waiting for someone foolish enough to open it. The shadows in the mist seemed to stretch toward them, their hands clawing at the air, their whispers filling the room. The figures were no longer just apparitions but tangible horrors, their cold hands grazing the visitor's skin as they scrambled for an escape that didn't exist. As the last of the group reached for the door, it opened, but not to the outside. It led them back into the heart of the museum, to a new exhibit they hadn't seen before, their own terrified faces, frozen in time, displayed within a glass case. The woman behind the counter was gone, and in her place the tour guide stood, his eyes glazed and empty. "It's always the last room," he murmured. "Once you see it, you can never leave." And as the museum's doors closed once more, sealing them inside, the whispers began again this time. It was their voices joining the chorus of the damned. The museum would never be empty again. The air grew heavier, thick with a suffocating darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The flickering lights above cast the room into sporadic flashes of shadow, making the shifting forms of the long-dead souls within the fog even more terrifying. The tourists, now desperate, clawed at the walls, but the museum itself had transformed, as if the very structure was alive, its walls shifting and warping around them, closing them into a labyrinth of terror. There was no clear path to escape, only endless corridors, their eerie echoes mocking their every step. As they stumbled through the narrow passageways, each door they opened only led them deeper into the nightmare. A low, mournful moan resonated through the walls. Was it the souls trapped within the museum, or something else entirely? The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse, like the heartbeat of the place itself. The tourists' breath came in ragged gasps, fear clutching at their hearts as they realized that they were no longer in control. They rounded another corner, their feet slipping on the slick, damp floor. It was then that they saw her, the woman from the counter, standing in the middle of a dimly lit corridor, her pale face an unsettling mask of calm. The tour guide stood beside her, no longer the nervous young man they had once known. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his lips curled into a grim, knowing smile as he slowly stepped toward them. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice no longer crackling, but cold, smooth, and piercing. "You've come for the true stories, the ones that never end. But there's a price for knowledge, a price you're all paying now." The group recoiled in horror, realizing too late that they had crossed a line that no one should ever cross. The guide's smile widened, his voice low and guttural. "The museum, it chooses. It chooses who stays, who joins the collection, and who remains. Forever." The room began to shift again, walls rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by an unseen force. The paintings on the walls no longer depicted harmless landscapes or distant shores, but twisted, nightmarish scenes of agony and suffering, figures writhing in pain, mouths gaping in silent screams. The figures in the paintings seemed to move as if trapped in some eternal, tormenting cycle. It was as if the souls who had once been alive were now trapped in these portraits, forever cursed to relive their final moments, their faces frozen in terror. But there was no time to process this horrific sight. A deafening crash sounded from above, and a dark shape fell from the ceiling, something large, something unnatural, landing with a sickening thud. The mist in the room began to swirl violently, coiling and twisting like a living thing, wrapping itself around the group. They tried to break free, but the air itself had turned into a force, pulling them closer, drawing them toward the center of the room. From the swirling darkness emerged the shape, a monstrous creature, half human, half shadow. Its face was a grotesque parody of a human face, twisted and malformed, with eyes black as coal and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. Its limbs were long, unnaturally long, and it dragged its fingers across the floor, leaving deep gouges in the stone. "You thought you were visitors," it hissed in a voice that sounded like the grinding of bones. "But you're not. You're ours now." The creature lunged at them, but as it did, the museum seemed to react. The walls groaned, and the very floor beneath their feet began to ripple like water. The shadows of the paintings began to stretch and twist, reaching toward them like tendrils, pulling at their legs. One by one, the tourists were yanked into the dark voids of the walls, their bodies twisted and contorted as if sucked into some unseen vortex. Their screams echoed through the halls, but no one was there to hear them. The woman behind the counter stood motionless, watching as the last of the tourists disappeared. The tour guide, now fully consumed by the museum's curse, turned toward her, his eyes still empty, but his lips curling into a wicked grin. "Another batch," he said softly, his voice hollow. "They always come, and they always leave. As part of the collection." The woman nodded, her face darkening. "Yes, the museum is always hungry, and it never forgets." The two of them turned to face the heart of the museum, where the box of souls still sat upon its pedestal, now glowing faintly with an ominous, pulsating light. It beckoned to them as if it too was awaiting the next lost soul to fall into its trap. From that moment, the museum was alive, more than just a building. It had become a place where time no longer had meaning, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred. The souls of those who had entered were now woven into the museum's very fabric, trapped forever within its cursed walls. And as new visitors wandered in, lured by the promise of forbidden knowledge, the museum would continue to claim them, one by one. The door would creak open again, and the cycle would begin anew. "Welcome," the woman would whisper, her voice barely more than a breath. "Step inside, and become part of the story that never ends." And so it was that the museum remained, its dark, twisting corridors forever echoing with the whispers of the damned, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter its gates. The door creaked open once again. The faintest light from the outside world barely filtered in through the cracked doorframe, casting long shadows across the empty, dust-choked corridor. For a brief moment, it seemed like an invitation, a promise of freedom. But as the door swung wider, the familiar, suffocating darkness of the museum loomed in, enveloping everything in its oppressive grip. Standing in the doorway were the latest visitors, a fresh group of thrill-seekers, their faces alight with excitement, unaware of the horrors they were about to face. A man with a camera, a woman with an excited grin, and a young couple holding hands as they crossed the threshold, eager for the stories, the adventure, the thrills. But as they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with an unnatural force, the sound echoing through the building like a prison cell locking. The woman at the counter, her face now hidden in the shadow of her hood, rose slowly, her old, gnarled fingers still clutched around the knitting needles. Her eyes glinted with a dark, knowing gleam as she stepped from behind the counter. The tour guide, now completely indistinguishable from the horror that had consumed him, emerged from the depths of the museum. His face was pale, ashen, his lips twisted into a smile that was both welcoming and sinister. His hollow eyes flickered with the faintest hint of recognition. He knew the cycle had begun again. "Welcome," he murmured, his voice still deep and hollow. "You've come to experience the stories, yes? But remember, once you're here, you're never truly gone." The tourists looked at each other, confusion flickering on their faces. They were excited, expecting nothing more than a few creepy thrills, but now something in the air felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse with something, a dark energy that clung to the air, making every breath feel heavier. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile. "You've entered the horror museum, and in here, nothing is what it seems. The stories are more than just tales. They are alive." Her eyes narrowed, darkened with a deep, almost malicious joy. "And now, you will become part of them." The group froze, the words sinking in, their excitement now shifting to unease. The air seemed to darken further, the temperature dropping so quickly that their breath began to fog in the icy chill. The walls of the museum began to warp again, the corridors stretching, shifting, closing in on them. Their hearts raced as they tried to back away, but no matter how far they walked, it felt as though the space was never ending, the walls closing in with each step they took. The whispers started again. Low, sibilant, faint. The voices were distant at first, but as the walls closed in, they grew louder, more distinct. The tourists looked around, panic rising. Shapes began to form in the shifting darkness, emerging from the mist, pale, twisted figures, their faces obscured. but the unmistakable sound of tortured moans filled the air. The young man with the camera raised it, but his hand shook so violently that the lens blurred, capturing only the shadows that danced and writhed just beyond his view. "Not even the camera can save you," the woman's voice echoed from the dark. "Nothing can save you." And then they appeared, the twisted, disfigured remnants of those who had come before. The faces of the lost souls, their eyes wide with eternal terror, their mouths open in silent screams. The tourists tried to run, but the walls no longer just walls closed in, pushing them deeper into the museum. The paintings on the walls began to twist and shift, revealing horrific new scenes of death and torment, their figures reaching out as though trying to claw their way out of the canvas. The couple, frozen in terror, grasped each other's hands, but as they looked at one another, the hands they were holding began to wither and decay, flesh rotting away until they were nothing but skeletal remains. The man with the camera turned to run, but he stopped in his tracks, staring at something that made his blood run cold. The box of souls. It sat there, pulsing on its pedestal, its glow now an angry red. The lid creaked open slightly, and from within, something ancient and unspeakable stirred. The whispers, now a chorus of maddening voices, grew louder, and in that instant, the true horror of the museum was revealed. A shadow, darker than any darkness they had ever known, poured from the box. It was a void, an all-consuming blackness that seemed to suck in all light, all sound, all hope. The figures, the faces, the screams of the souls, all were swallowed by it. The mist thickened, curling around the tourists like chains, pulling them toward the box. The woman's voice came again, louder now, a whisper that reverberated through every inch of the museum. "Now you are part of the story that never ends." The box of souls opened wider, and as they were dragged toward it, the last thing the tourists saw was the glowing red light from within. Their screams were cut off as they were consumed, their souls bound within the box, joining the eternal collection. The doors of the museum closed once again, but this time no sound came from within. The darkened windows, once filled with faint glimpses of figures moving behind them, were now empty. The whispers had stopped. The building was silent. And yet, if one were to stand outside the museum at night, the faintest glimmer of red light could be seen, flickering through the cracks in the walls. The box of souls continued to pulse within, waiting for the next group of souls foolish enough to enter. Because in this place, the horror never truly ends. It only waits for new stories to tell. The museum was always hungry, and it would always find its next victim.